The era of the Wild West, partner, it stretched from the 1860s to the early 1900s. That was a time when folks were heading out west in droves, claiming land for their own, while cowpokes and varmints roamed the open range. Life out on the American frontier, well, let me tell you, it was a rough and tumble affair. Families trekking along the Oregon Trail and them other paths west, they had to watch their backs for all sorts of dangers. Bandits and outlaws running amok, rustling horses and holding up them trains. Now, the women folk, they were outnumbered by the men folk by a country mile, and they had to take on work that matched. It's no wonder folks are still downright fascinated by the Wild West, partner. There's a passel of mighty interesting things about life out there on the frontier. So, let me share a few tidbits about the Wild West and them folks who lived through them wild and woolly times. But before that, if you are new to this channel, please subscribe the channel and like the video. The Wild West, partner. It was a time of downright impressive innovation. Out there on the frontier, it might have seemed like innovations were as rare as a desert rain, with settlers dwelling in humble cabins and frontier towns lacking the fancy trappings of them established eastern places. But don't you worry none, innovations were happening on a grander scale. Railroads were stretching their steel tracks farther and farther west, while telegraphs and telephones were bridging the gaps across those long distances. Yep, America was seeing all sorts of innovations, like that there railroad system, especially in the latter half of the 1800s. Now, the women folk in the Wild West, they weren't sitting idle either. They got together and formed clubs. They did, all in the name of promoting the arts and culture. Them women's clubs sprouted up like tumbleweeds across the Wild West. Them married gals who ventured west with their husbands worked harder than a mule in a dust storm to turn that wild land into their new home. They banded together, you see, organizing clubs and events that celebrated the arts, culture, and shared interests. While them women folk back east might have turned up their noses at the notion of settling out west, them women in the clubs, they stood tall and insisted their towns and cities were every bit as civilized as their eastern counterparts. Now, it's true, partner, that when folks think of the Wild West, they often think of ladies of the night, and, well, there were indeed women plying that trade. Seems them ladies had plenty of customers, what with men outnumbering them 25 to 1. But now, listen up, that weren't the only work available for single gals. You'd find saloon girls, dance hall girls, and hostesses entertaining folks in them saloons. They'd sing, they'd dance, and they'd have a good old chat with the patrons. These here female entertainers, they earned themselves a cool 10 a week, plus a cut of the drinks sold. They'd chat or dance with a fella, and then kindly direct him to the bar, pocketing a bit of change from his drinking. Now, some of them women, they chose to offer a bit more than entertaining, if you catch my drift. When it comes to the Pony Express, they had quite the track record. They only lost themselves a single mail sack during their run. You see, the Pony Express was a short-lived but mighty efficient mail service that stretched from Missouri all the way to California. Them riders covered a whopping 650,000 miles and delivered some 35,000 pieces of mail during them 18 months of operation. Now, them riders, they weren't no seasoned cowboys, mind you. The average feller in the saddle was a spry 19 years old and raked in a fair $100 to $150 per month for their troubles. Now, reckon you might have heard the term lead-footed nowadays, mostly when folks are talking about driving too fast. But back in them Wild West days, lead-footed had itself a different meaning. You didn't want to be lead-footed out on the range, no sir. You see, while life might have moved slower than a tortoise in a molasses swamp in them days, there were plenty of times when speed was the name of the game. Cowboys, farmers, and the like, they needed to be quick on the draw, so to speak. If you were poking along too slow, well, that wouldn't have done you no favors, especially when it came to rustling cattle or tending to the land. Now, them railroad folks, they knew a thing or two about protecting their cargo and passengers from them bandits. You see, train robberies were a real concern back then. And that's where the railroad police came in. Them railroad police. They're still around today. But they got their start back in the 1860s as the guardians of them trains. These lawmen, they kept a watchful eye on the tracks and made sure no good-for-nothing varmints tried to rob a train. They were the last line of defense out there on the frontier, protecting the precious cargo rolling across the land. Now, when it comes to cowboys, reckon you might have a picture in your mind of what they looked like, all thanks to them spaghetti westerns from the 1950s. But in reality, not all cowboys fit that there modern stereotype. You see, about a quarter of them cowboys were African American. Many of them were once slaves working as cowboys, and they carried on with the cowboy way of life even after the Civil War set them free. Some were born free and chose to be cowboys from the get-go. So, round about 25% of them, cowboys were African American. Now, when it comes to Kid Curry, well, he was one ruthless feller. While not all of Butch Cassidy's gang took to killing with such glee, Kid Curry sure did. He had himself a real hate for lawmen, especially sheriffs, and he took pride in taking them out. But Kid Curry, he also had himself a bit of a reputation for visiting them brothels. It's said he may have sired as many as 85 young uns with them ladies of the night. Them little ones, they came to be known as them Curry Kids, all thanks to Kid Curry's rowdy ways. Now, partner, it's worth noting that not every gunfighter met their maker in a blaze of bullets. Some of them old gunslingers, believe it or not, lived to see their 70s. While it might sound plumb crazy given how perilous that line of work was, about a third of them gunfighters, well, they passed away from natural causes. Now let's mosey on over to the story of that iconic cowboy hat. You see, when folks picture the Wild West, that hat is as recognizable as a sheriff's badge. But most cowboys back in the day, they didn't sport the same hat we reckon as the cowboy hat today. It was a fella by the name of John Batterson Stetson who cooked up this style of headgear back in the 1860s. His fancy hat quickly caught the eye of cowboys far and wide, and before you knew it, it became the talk of the prairie. By 1906, Stetson's company was selling a whopping 2 million cowboy hats every year, and that's a heap of hats for them cowpokes to tip to the ladies. Now, let's talk cattle drives. You see, moving cattle from one place to another wasn't no Sunday stroll. Them cattle drives, well, they took months to wrangle. It was one of the biggest to-dos in a cowboy's life, no doubt about it. Them cattle needed to be rounded up and herded across a fair piece of land to find themselves a buyer. On them grand drives stretching from Texas all the way up to Montana, it could take as long as 5 months to get the job done. Cowboys and them cattle, they hoofed it about 10 to 12 miles each day. You see, it was a slow and steady journey, 'cause them cattle needed their fill of grass along the way. A hungry cow is a restless cow, and we sure didn't want no stampedes in them parts. Them pioneers heading westward were given some sound advice. Pack enough grub to last 110 days. You see, food was as precious as gold on them trails, and the smartest ones made sure they had plenty. Some of them trail guides even went so far as to recommend families tote along enough victuals to keep them going for 110 days straight. Now, them folks who really knew what they were doing, they'd bring themselves a milk cow along for the ride. That way, they could enjoy fresh dairy right on the trail. Others, well, they had to make do with what they could scrounge up, and that sometimes meant hunting game or even using roadkill to fill their bellies. As for getting from one place to another, traveling the Oregon Trail wasn't no Sunday picnic. It was a slow and downright vexing journey. You see, the daily routine included meals, resting, and driving, and that would add up to about 18 to 20 miles each day. But I'll tell you, not every day was a walk in the park. Them trails out west, they were as clear as mud, and directions were mighty sketchy. Some days folks found themselves going round in circles, and that's enough to drive a person plumb crazy. Now, here's the part that'll put a lump in your throat. Them desolate landscapes along the trail, they became the resting places for thousands of travelers. It's a hard truth that 1 in every 10 Oregon Trail emigrants met their maker on that treacherous journey. The unforgiving terrain turned simple mistakes into matters of life and death. Things like running out of food or forgetting to give the animals a rest could mean starving or getting stranded. Most folks met their end from diseases, accidents, or wounds, and graves for both folks, and critters peppered the sides of them trails in numbers that'd break your heart.